Hello, welcome back to the Entangled Health Podcast. Today we are chugging along with more lessons from the natural world, and this episode is particularly near and dear to me because this episode will be about mushrooms. And as maybe you know, I have a book coming out on August 3rd called Our Ancestors Want Us to Be Mushrooms. And it's sort of in the other side of my work that I don't always talk about here around like doula care and reconnecting to ourself, each other, and the planet. But I'm so excited that it's coming out and just didn't feel like this could be that I could do this session without bringing mushrooms into it since I've been so deep in the wisdom of mushrooms for the past couple of years, researching and writing the book, and now sort of on the PR of it all as I prepare for it to come out. So, mushrooms, as you likely know, are sort of having a moment. There's definitely this like increased interest in mushrooms. And then at the same time, mushrooms like really weird some people out. And I totally understand that too. And they've been associated with plagues and witches and things like that for so much of our human history. And so they're just such a fascinating species to me. And in the book, I write about 8 key characteristics of mushrooms that humans have as well, and how if we can like get back and reconnect with those, we can, move back into right relationship with ourselves and each other and the planet, to, get back on track towards a more livable and abundant and just world for all. So I'm excited to be bringing that world of my work over into the Entangled Health podcast today to talk about mushrooms with you. I could talk about mushrooms all day, every day. There are days where I do talk about them all day. And just excited to have this conversation about what we can learn from mushrooms in our community driven community connection work. Um, and, one of the key things about mushrooms, especially as it relates to the work we all do, is that mushrooms do so much work that nobody sees, right? They do the underground work, they build the connections. They're like the sort of like the conversations that happen before convening start, or trust that gets built at the water cooler or the hallway. um, Mushrooms do this like unglamorous essential labor of breaking down what's no longer working so something new can grow, and composting and connecting and building. And so mushrooms like do the work beneath the work, not to get too meta, but that's what our community driven, story driven strategy work does too, right? It's that laying the groundwork, that root system, that work under the work, the composting, the trying again, the maintenance that mushrooms have so much to teach us about. So, so often when we see a mushroom, we think that's the whole organism. But as you may know, the mushroom, the fruiting body, is only the visible part. And the real organism is the mycelium, which is like this really vast underground network of threads that connect root systems and share nutrients and send chemical signals to the forest floor. And they do, there's been a lot of research about like communication across the forest floor, and a lot of that's carried through mushrooms. And so they do so much supporting of every species on the earth. And one thing I love about them is they are the species that, like, when all of life was in like sort of that primordial goo and in water, they were what sort of carried life onto earth. Fungus did, and mushrooms did, and mycelium did, to to make plants and animal life possible. And so they're just this fascinating species that life on earth wouldn't be possible without. And they're so ancient and have so much to teach us. And they keep us all alive. They keep the full forest alive. Like, I learned too in research for my book that every single breath we take has some spores in it, some mycelium, and every single step we take, we're walking on mycelial networks. And so there's no part of the world, there's no breath we take, there's no part of our day untouched by our interactions with mycelium. Um, and yeah, and so the most important things that happen in, as I mentioned, in story driven strategy, and that deep listening built strategy, are not the things that usually end up on the slide deck, right? They're those sidebar conversations and the trust built over meals, and the real attunement to needs, and the staff member who's able to build up the courage to say what's actually going on and what they need. And So mycelium really represent to me these relationships that get tended to long before anybody's ready to call a partnership, or an initiative. That's what mycelium does. And that's so core to the work we all want to be doing, right? As well. And so, y- you know, let's just dive in a little bit into these magical little creatures. So, um, mycorrhizae Mycorrhizal fungi, mycelium underground, they form these symbiotic relationships with plant roots. And the fungus extends the plant root system so that they have more access to water and nutrients that the plant wouldn't be able to reach on its own just through its own roots. I know in the cedar episode, we talked about those deep, deep root systems and what allows cedar to be so powerful and so grounded in these like otherwise inhospitable soil areas is often these relationships with fungi. And so, in return, then the plant shares sugar from photosynthesis, and so there's this symbiotic relationship, right? The fungi extend the plant root system and deliver that water and keep the plant healthy. And in return, the mycelial network is the fungi is fed by the sugars of the plant. So again, it's this thing we've talked about with the beavers and with others. It's this symbiosis. It's this, they neither would thrive in the same way alone. And that's what we want in our teams. And that's what we want in our organizations is this ability to thrive and to, work together and show up for each other. Whereas like we are in our zone of genius, they are in their zone of genius, and that there's that symbiosis, that mutual support. And that can only happen through trust, right? And trust happens through that deep listening, through responding to what's actually alive for community, for staff, for other organizations. And scientists have called this the wood wide web, that network I talked that touches like literally every corner of the earth. The one thing that I'll say there though is that, like there are billions of people without access to reliable internet, and we are all breathing in mycelium. So mycelium is even more present than like any other service or any other entity on the planet. And so in this way, these mycelial networks, they connect these trees together, as I mentioned, and then trees use these fungal networks to share resources with older, more established trees that will send nutrients to younger seedlings across the mushrooms. And so the forest communicates and redistributes through this network. And I just think that's so beautiful of like, the fungi are the species in the middle that's making that possible, making that sharing possible, creating that network where communication can happen. And that's so much what a responsive, community driven, story driven strategy is, right? Is living out and working in response to what's needed in the community, sharing resources, getting everybody connected, making sure communication's flowing so resources are being used well. It's all of that like that connection work that we all do in this work that is so crucial in the natural world as well that fungi do. One other thing that I think is so important is that fungi are our planet's decomposers, right? They break down organic matter, fallen trees, leaf litter, um, and transform it into nutrients that make new soil, and they make new soil. And without decomposition, like life on Earth wouldn't be possible, right? Like we'd be walking on top of miles and miles of undecomposed matter, um, and I think that's really important. And I mentioned earlier too the communication, but it's worth putting a finer point on that mycelium can send these chemical warning signals through their network when part of the forest is under attack from like a pest or disease, and this gives connected plants a chance to like mount their own defense. And so they raise the flag and say something's not right here, something's going on, prepare yourselves. Um, And some fungi can also break down pollutants, including petroleum and pesticides and heavy metals. And they can literally like clean contaminated soils, and they are, present after oil spills, digesting what we see as like undigestible and the parts of the ecosystem that and like we think of like oil spills and these things of like these stains on natural world, and mushrooms are what can like alchemize it into livable substances and clean up and protect the species around by doing that decomposition and that like alchemy work. Um, And so, what does this have to do with the work we're doing? Well, part of it is that most of the real work that we're doing is a little bit underground, right? The mushroom is what the people see, but the mycelium is what makes the forest function. And in organizations, the visible outputs, the campaign, the report, the event, those are the fruiting bodies, right? Those are the mushrooms. But the real work is that network of relationships and trust and shared understanding beneath them, and those finding new connections and having that healthy ecosystem and all of that fed. And so, when we as organizations invest only in the visible outputs and neglect that relational infrastructure, we, are harvesting the mushroom and starving the mycelium. We're not on firm ground. We don't have what we need in order to start taking the mushrooms. And there's always like certainly for indigenous folks and my people for sure, we have this sense of like the honorable harvest, right? You don't overtake. You don't um yeah, take on more than you need, and even if you want more, you make sure that there's still enough mushrooms left over to for animals, for the health of that group of mushrooms, things like that. And so we never take it all. And I think that that's just so important about, if we are only investing in the nice shiny things, we have this like it's not sustainable, right? We're plucking and plucking, but we're not nourishing what's underground. And what's underground is really at the heart of the work that we do. And it's those relationships and that trust and that listening and those stories that are the foundation for what we do. And we can't starve our work of that if we want good work, sustainable work, meaningful work, true work. And I think that's something that mushrooms always help me understand and remember, right? Is that decomposition is not destruction. So, fungi, as I mentioned, they break down what's dead so it can feed what's alive. And like composting piles are, so much of it is the mycelium that's there. And so that's what's so important in organizations is that when we're willing to let go of the narrative that isn't working anymore, or the extractive practices, or the origin story that no longer reflects, who we are, or the comms points that don't really get to the impact we're having, things like that. It's we want to be able to like learn from all of those and the programs that, a couple of things work, but they're not quite reaching our community. All of those things, we want to be able to send them to the compost, right? And we want them to be able to decompose so that that energy can create fertile soil for what does work. And we take all of the lessons and all of the nutrients of that to be able to create what does work. And I just think that that's like one of the best lessons is always being willing to like send things to the compost pile and see what comes back time and time again. And, something so important is that the network is what redistributes resources. Older trees, send nutrients to younger seedlings through this mycelial network. And that's what healthy organizations do, right? With our capacity. We mentor and support, what's just starting in others, and coalition partners come together with that deep community trust of what we've learned and what we're building. And so that, in healthy ecosystems and healthy networks, there's that redistribution, right? There isn't that hoarding. And, one other really important thing is that we can't force the fruiting, right? Mushrooms appear when conditions are right, not when they're scheduled, not when they're rushed, not when we think they might come. I was actually in a mushroom foraging workshop or like, yeah, I think apprenticeship last year. And it was like 7 months, and we met one Saturday each month for 7 months. And, it was after two really, really rainy years in Vermont that contributed to flooding. This was the summer after the second really rainy summer. And it was just a dry summer. Like we just, we had a really dry summer. And so we were, we'd signed up for the class. We had our cute little baskets ready to forage mushrooms. And there wasn't a lot there. And we couldn't make them be there, right? Like even the instructor of the course is like, I'm making my best guesses, but I can't make the mushrooms appear. Um, and I think that's so important for the work we're doing. So often, I see organizations are like, oh, we just need three good stories for this, this, and this. And it's like, well, if you had built your foundation on listening and on great stories, then you'd have the community wisdom. You'd already have the community trust that you could have 100 great stories. You'd have all these things in place so there wouldn't be this sort of like forcing the fruiting of like three great things and like pushing past the point of trust or comfort and things, that extraction. And instead, just like when we nurture that like decomposition and that resource sharing and that trust building and those deep, really strong networks underground, then we don't have to worry about fruiting because the fruit is always growing and we know that we're in a healthy ecosystem. Um, and as I mentioned, the mycelium can really send these chemical signals when part of the network is under threat. And that's what a healthy storytelling and like deep listening ecosystem does. That's what ongoing community, when the narrative landscape shifts or when misinformation is spreading or when crisis is brewing, the organization that has that sort of relational infrastructure in place hears about it first from the network and understands that and can be respond and protect and let others know. But if we don't have that deep um, trust and that network, if we're not plugged into that network, we don't like feel that vibration before the threat arrives. And so, that's really key to think about. It's that groundwork, that invisible work over time that like protects us and allows us to protect others. And then, I always come back to, and I've mentioned it in a few of these other species conversations, is symbiosis. These mycorrhizal relationships are genuinely mutual. The fungus gets something, the plant gets something. There are times and there are instances where like some fungi go a little out of whack and they're purely extractive, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the symbiotic ones. Um, in this way of, when we sit down to really listen to community and gather story in a good way, it's not this we're here to serve you as a one-way transaction, and it's not this like we need your story for a grant. Rather, there's this relationship where both parties are improved by the exchange, and that trust is there, and the listening changes the organization and the storytelling changes the community, and there's just like this really good healthy flow that we need. And finally, like it's important to say, and we talked about this with cedar as well, is that fungi, they break down those toxins in contaminated ground um and clean the soil. And we want organizations and communities. um we understand that some of us are working in contexts where that soil has been poisoned by extractive practices and broken promises and tokenization and all of these things. And the work of this like ethical, deep listening, story-based strategy is, um, understanding that sometimes you have to start with remediation and acknowledge the contamination and do that slow, somewhat unglamorous work of cleaning the soil and having that be a part of the work that gets us to that more trust-building symbiotic relationship. And so, got some questions for you as we come to the close of this. Um, Thinking about what's the mycelium of your organization, what are those invisible networks that connect everything? And are you tending to it? Are you tending to it? Or are you so focused on producing sort of that forced fruit, that visible mushroom that, that underground, really important network is starving? And also, something that I really invite you to think about and can be hard to look at, but can also be really freeing is what needs to decompose. What story or practice or habit, needs to go or approach to things. And, it's taking up space and how could it benefit by feeding new growth? And, just remembering that decomposition is not a failure of the organism. It's how things keep going. It's the way of life. So thank you so much for tuning in to my beloved mushroom episode. It's so fun to talk about. Again, like I talk and think and write about mushrooms all the time, and so fun to bring it over into this context where I don't always apply it as much and just let the mushroom go wild here. And yeah, thank you so much. And I hope to be in touch soon. And let me know if you want to connect, you can book a call and we can find what support might be best for you based on where you are. And we've got a few, as always, Story Lab sessions available for that real, springboard into this important work. And so grateful for the time you spend with me and for thinking about mushrooms. And I hope it inspired a little bit of awe and that you can see mushrooms a little bit differently. Or and would love to hear if there's anything else you want to share about your knowledge of mushrooms. I know that so many of us have different knowledge of them. So sending so much care and stay well, stay safe, and I'll talk to you soon.